Let's bring in former Democratic Senator Jon Tester from Montana and MSNBC political analyst. David Drucker is senior writer at The Dispatch and an MSNBC contributor. Guys, it's good to see you. Look, both sides say they don't want to shut down. I can say I don't think the American people would like to have a shutdown. Go out on a limb there. Senator, you know these players. You serve next to most of them. What do you think is going on behind the scenes, if anything? And is there someone you think who could be influential to get some change here beyond leadership?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know that there's a lot going on right now, to be honest with you. But they could be talking. They should be talking. The truth is, Chris, this is something that's being done once again at the 11th hour or past, and should have been talked about for the last year on how we're going to get a budget that works for this country long term. And a CR isn't long term, but it will be a stopgap measure to keep the government open. Look, the players in this, the biggest player is the president. If the president walked in and said, hey, we need to make sure that we keep health care accessible and affordable for everybody across the country, it would be in the bill. There's no doubt about it. It has been apparent from the beginning that the leadership in the Senate and the House and the majority party, the Republicans, have done what the president wants, and that's all they've done. And so the big dog in the room is the president. And if the president was to come forward and say, hey, I think this is important to keep health care accessible and affordable, it would be done, and we wouldn't be talking about a shutdown.
So, David, Republican pollster John McLaughlin has argued that not extending the Obamacare subsidies would result in what he calls a health care tax hike, posing the greatest midterm threat to the GOP. Again, Schumer says he told the president he can solve the problem if he can just convince Republican leaders to extend Obamacare subsidies. But what are that chances you think that happens in the coming days? I mean, they're not even coming back until Friday.
Yeah, listen, I mean, we'll have to see how this turns out. But, you know, as these things usually do, this is really a political power struggle, right? Democrats want certain conditions for their votes in the Senate in order to avoid a shutdown. And Republicans are saying that, listen, we control the House. We're a majority in the Senate, and we control the White House. So we essentially should get to do what we want. These things are, you know, often blame is often in the eye of the partisan here. What I would say, and I think the senator probably remembers this, is the party that instigates the shutdown or uses government funding as leverage to achieve a policy outcome, even if that policy outcome is popular, usually gets blamed for the shutdown. And voters tend to look at shutdowns, and I've told you this before, Chris, obviously, as an illegitimate form of political combat. And it takes me back to 2013. Obamacare at the time was still unpopular, not like it is today, popular. It was very unpopular. And when Senate Republicans said, we're going to stop this thing you don't like by holding government funding hostage in order to get President Obama to not implement this, voters revolted. They didn't like it. They think you should be able to work through the normal legislative process, however broken it is, while keeping the government lights on in order to try and achieve these policy outcomes.
So, Senator, those health care premium hikes would come at a time when Americans, I don't have to tell you, are already feeling the squeeze. The administration preparing a new round of tariffs that could raise prices on things like kitchen cabinets and vanities, and investors are beginning to worry that the rally of the stock market may be about to end. Many Americans, no surprise, rely on that for their retirement. Is there also something else in here, a kind of cumulative effect? Maybe if voters weren't feeling the pinch in so many other ways, the possibility of a hike in health care might be something different.
I think it adds another weight on small businesses and working families. I think the inflation that we've experienced, particularly since the inauguration, has been real and it's been significant. I think the increase in healthcare premiums, which is pretty damn essential for families around this country, could absolutely do some real damage, not only to the businesses and to the working families in this country, but also to electoral politics. But as David said, who gets the blame is going to be a big part of this, and how this is messaged and move as they move forward is going to be a part of this. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to claim that it's not their problem when they control the House, the Senate, and the president's office. But it's all about messaging. In the end, though, Chris, here's what you need to keep in mind, and I know you know this: the people who really get hurt are the folks that are out there trying to make a living, whether that's a small business person or a working family. And right now, with inflation and with the way the economy's going, I don't think they can handle additional expenses, especially when they're unnecessarily tacked on these folks.
In your wheelhouse, David, with the margins in both the House and Senate so tight. Is it too naive to think that a small block of centrists from both parties could make a case for a pragmatic approach, something you have written about?
Yeah, well, anybody could make a pragmatic pitch for anything, but first they'd have to agree to do it. And look, we're just in an era where...
Details, David. Why do you always have to point out the details?
Yeah, I mean, look, Democrats... By the way, my analysis of shutdown politics is separate from my analysis of midterm politics. I mean, Democrats have a great case to make if they want to make it about the president's management of the economy, particularly as it relates to trade and tariffs and that agenda's effect on inflation, which has been, well, it's been inflationary as opposed to bringing costs down, which is basically the number one issue of almost every voter that both parties are going to focus on next year. The question is how you go about this. We could see coalitions in Congress try and tackle this in a pragmatic way, but given the partisan operation of both parties on the Hill, it's just not something we tend to see often over the past, or have tended to see over the past, almost 20 years.
Can I ask you a totally off-topic question, David?
Sure.
About what percentage of books in the bookcase behind you are not about politics?
Too few.
That's exactly what I was thinking about my own. We got to fix that. Senator Jon Tester, David Drucker, great to have both of you here.
Look, Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and of course the White House. They have a lot of power. And let's be honest, Republicans in the House and Senate are Trump's lapdogs at this point. Whatever he wants, they pretty much do, with a few exceptions. Which is why it is so concerning that not only does Trump not seem to care about the impact of a government shutdown on the American people, but doesn't even seem to know what the impact might be. I mean, yesterday, the Democratic leaders of the House and Senate, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, met with the president directly. And here was how Senator Schumer described that meeting.
We laid out to the president some of the consequences of what's happening in health care. And by his face and by the way he looked, I think he heard about them for the first time.
Now, at the core of the fight over the shutdown right now is one wonky but deeply important issue because it impacts millions of people: health insurance subsidies. Back in 2021, the Biden administration passed a COVID relief bill that, among many other things, expanded access to health care plans under the Affordable Care Act and provided tax credits to make health care premiums more affordable for tens of millions of Americans. Right now, about 22 million Americans rely on those subsidies, but they are set to disappear at the end of the year if Congress doesn't act. Now, that would mean insurance premiums for tens of millions of Americans could skyrocket. For a lot of American families, that's not just painful, it's untenable. They can't afford it. And the Congressional Budget Office even estimates that without those subsidies, more than 4 million Americans would lose their insurance in the next decade. Democrats want those subsidies funded by the federal government. They want to prevent millions of Americans from being tossed off of their health care. That is the holdup. That is why Trump and Republicans are steering the government towards a shutdown, because they are unwilling to budge on that issue. And much like we saw during his speech to top military brass today, Trump seems to have completely lost the thread here. It's not just that he doesn't understand the issue. He doesn't even seem to know who he's negotiating with.
Chuck Schumer, who was here yesterday, along with a very nice gentleman who I didn't really know. You know who I'm talking about.
His name is Hakeem Jeffries, Mr. President. He's very knowable. He's the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, and he joins me now. It's great to see you, Leader Jeffries. You've had quite a 48 hours, I will say. We are less than 3 hours away from this shutdown. And I just wanted to start by asking you, I mean, you said today we're in this fight until we win. I think a lot of people are happy to hear that. Tell us more about what that looks like. How does this end for people?
Well, we're here in the Capitol, and as Leader Schumer has said, as I've repeatedly said, as House Democrats continue to say, we're ready, we're willing, we're able to sit down with anyone, anytime, any place to arrive at a bipartisan spending agreement that actually meets the needs of the American people, avoids a shutdown, and keeps the government open. But at the same period of time, what we also have made clear is that we're not going to support a partisan Republican spending bill that continues to gut the health care of the American people in the midst of a Republican health care crisis that is devastating to people all across the country. Republicans, as you pointed out, control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. They have the ability to fund the government, but to the extent that they're interested in Democratic support, then of course we want to make sure, as part of a bipartisan process, that we are looking out for the American people in rural America, in urban America, in small town America, in the heartland of America, and in black and brown communities all across America, collectively, all of whom have been devastated in different ways by the ongoing Republican assault on health care.
I just played a clip, and I think everybody watching knows you and Leader Schumer went to the White House yesterday. I played a clip of that, but I want to play something that Trump said today, because I think it's important to show people how difficult this is. So let's just play that. We'll talk about it afterwards.
A lot of good can come down from shutdowns. We can get rid of a lot of things that we didn't want, and they'd be Democrat things.
I mean, I suppose he sometimes says the quiet part out loud, but he says there a lot of good things can come from shutdowns. What do you think he means by that? And what are you preparing for him to do during this shutdown?
Well, it's such a shocking statement that he would make, because he's the president of the United States of America. Yeah. And we shouldn't look at the consequences of a shutdown as impacting Democrats or impacting Republicans. It impacts Americans. Food safety, of course, will be impacted. Airline and aviation safety impacted. That affects everyone. And millions of older Americans who have come to rely on telemedicine won't have the ability to access that level of medical care. That impacts everyone. And this is on top of the consequences of the one big ugly bill, which included the largest assault, the largest cut to Medicaid in American history. And in this bill, they stole food from the mouths of hungry children, families, seniors, and veterans, Democrats and Republicans alike. And all of that was done so they could reward their billionaire donors with massive tax breaks. And they basically want to continue this scheme, but they want to do it with Democratic support. And that, of course, is a bridge way too far. That's not going to happen. So we're urging reasonable Republicans to come to the table. I'll be at the Capitol all night. Let's have a conversation about finding a common sense path forward to meet the needs of all Americans, as opposed to continuing to devastate everyday Americans.
So it seemed to, I mean, part of the challenge here for you, or you tell me, seems to be Trump is controlling a huge swath of the caucus, including the Speaker of the House, who seems to do whatever he wants. You're saying, hey, Republicans, come meet with me. I'm happy to talk to you about a path forward here. You said you want a bipartisan deal. Is Trump, do you go meet with him if he wants to meet again? Or what does it look like tomorrow? How do you move forward?
Well, in the White House meeting yesterday, I certainly made clear, and so did Leader Schumer, that we demanded the meeting with Donald Trump because at the end of the day, Republicans no longer function in the Congress as a separate and co-equal branch of government. And the reality is, when Donald Trump says jump, the Republicans say how high. And they've served as nothing more than a reckless rubber stamp for Donald Trump's extreme agenda throughout the year. So the reality is, Donald Trump's going to shut the government down. Republicans are going to acquiesce to that, which is why House Republicans aren't even in town, if you can believe it. House Democrats are here on duty. Republicans remain on vacation. And so this is going to have to come down to, eventually, the Trump administration recognizing that their own shutdown is going to be a consequence that will hurt them with the American people, who are smart enough to know it's being caused by Donald Trump and the Republicans. Come to the table so we can work something out that also includes protecting the health care of the American people.
Do you think Trump even wants the government to reopen?
Well, that remains to be seen. We'll certainly begin to find that out after midnight. We also know that since January 20th, Donald Trump has been waging war against the federal government, against hardworking federal employees and civil servants, and decimating parts of the government, which impacts the ability to provide necessary services to everyday Americans. And that's been happening over the last several months, pretty much from the beginning of his administration, which is why I think many people have reasonably come to believe that from the very beginning of this process, Donald Trump and Republicans have been determined to try to shut the government down. But the American people are going to rise up and not tolerate it. This has happened in the past. We know that during the 14-day government shutdown that was caused by Republicans in October of 2013, eventually their will broke because the American people said enough. And when Donald Trump was in office in 2018 into 2019, that was the longest government shutdown in American history, 35 days. And eventually, the Republicans engaged in an unconditional surrender because they could not sustain the pressure from the American people. It's my expectation that if we find ourselves in a shutdown, the same exact thing will happen again.
We've been through, I've been through a lot of shutdowns and negotiations. Often they're on the level, as my mother would say. This does not appear to be, in part because Trump is continuing to post racist and bizarre AI videos. There was one of you and Leader Schumer last night. I'm not going to play that. But just in the last hour, he posted another one of you. Today you said, which is a pretty strong comeback, the next time you have something to say about me, don't cop out through a racist and fake AI video. When I'm back in the Oval Office, say it to my face. It's the pushing back that I think is very powerful in this moment. I got to ask, I mean, when you're back in the Oval Office, you may be. What are you going to say to his face about all this?
Well, I'm certainly going to make it clear that we need from the President of the United States an individual who actually is focused on doing his job, as opposed to engaging in racist or bigoted stereotypes designed to try to distract or throw us off as Democrats from what we need to do on behalf of the American people. And it ain't going to happen. And we're not going to be intimidated by this guy or by the Republicans who currently are divorced from the reality of the situation that as Democrats, we don't work for Donald Trump. We don't work for Vice President Vance. We don't work for their billionaire donors. We work for the American people. That's why we've drawn this line in the sand. And our view will continue to be cancel the cuts, lower the costs, save health care.
Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, I'll just repeat before I let you go. This is about Republicans being unwilling to fund subsidies that help millions of people stay on health care. That is what the holdup is. I appreciate you joining me tonight. Thank you so much.
Every American president in history has addressed the members of the military at vital moments in our country's history with care and intention and deep respect. It sounds something like this.
The people of this country do not appreciate how secure we are because of the devotion of men and their wives and children who serve this country in far-off places, in the sea, in the air, and on the ground, thousands and thousands of miles away from this country, who make it possible for us all to live in peace each day.
You all knew that some things are worth dying for. One's country is worth dying for, and democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man.
Freedom is not an accident. Progress is not an accident. Democracy is not an accident. These are things that have to be fought for. And you're part of that legacy. They must be won, and they've got to be tended to constantly and defended without fail.
But this president, the one we have now, the guy who once described the ultimate sacrifice, military members losing their lives, as ones being made only by, quote, losers and, quote, suckers, sounded very different today.
I've never walked into a room so silent before. This is very... Don't laugh, don't laugh. You're not allowed to do that. You know what? Just have a good time. I moved a submarine or two, I won't say about the two, over to the coast of Russia, just to be careful, because we can't let people throw around that word I call it the N word. There are two N words, and you can't use either of them. Can't use either of them. And I'm not a fan of some of the ships you do. I'm a very aesthetic person, and I don't like some of the ships you're doing aesthetically.
I was just taking notes to make sure I really heard what I heard. As you just heard and saw, Donald Trump played the part of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces today. He gave a speech before senior military leaders. It was, at turns, awkward, embarrassing. The whole thing was incredibly low energy, and the substance of what he said was deeply disturbing. The Trump administration dragged hundreds of the nation's top generals from posts all around the world for an event just hours ahead of a potential government shutdown. It's an event that presented all sorts of operational and logistical challenges and hardships and raises red flags about whether the military will be able to handle a crisis should something happen today or tomorrow while they're on their way back. As these images attest, the nation's senior military leaders, for the most part, sat in stone-faced silence as Trump talked at them for more than 1 hour. But in between the political attacks he made and the ranting and raving and meandering he did deliver a message that should alarm anyone who cares about the men and women in that room, or the institution of the military, or the Constitution, or democracy here and around the world. Because Donald Trump actually spent a good amount of time today laying the groundwork for the United States military to regularly and increasingly, and perhaps indefinitely, be deployed on the streets of American cities.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms. But we are under invasion from within. I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
That's where we start today. MSNBC Pentagon correspondent Priya Sardar is here. Also joining us, former Secretary of the Air Force and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, Secretary Frank Kendall is here. Retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Steve Anderson is here. And retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel and co-founder of the Truth in the Barrel podcast, Amy McGrath is here. Priya, I start with you for the headlines.
Yeah, that's right. So this speech came immediately following Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's speech, where he really railed against the Department of Defense and went into talking about why it has been rebranded the Department of War. And he said the reason for that is because the Department of Defense had become too woke. And he said that in order to essentially fix it, they needed to really roll back many of those DEI policies that he felt the previous administration put into place. And I know we're going to go into more detail about exactly what he rolled out today, but he essentially issued 10 new directives from the Department of War that these senior military leaders are now going to be required to implement. And a lot of them are changing things like grooming standards and physical standards. And he said that, you know, if the result of that is that we don't have women in combat roles anymore, then so be it. He also said that, you know, he wants to get rid of what he called debris. And he was essentially referring to a lot of the senior military leaders that he fired earlier this year. Many of them, by the way, were women and people of color who he says were promoted because of essentially trying to meet quotas, according to him, or being historic first. So when President Trump took the stage, he basically said that he agrees with everything that Defense Secretary Hegseth put into place, also calling this Department of Defense woke joke department. So that was really the tone that we saw today. As you mentioned, there wasn't much reaction from the audience, which is what was to be expected. Remember, these military leaders took an oath to the Constitution and the commander-in-chief, regardless of political party or persona. But President Trump also made kind of a joke and a little bit of a veiled threat. And he said, if you guys don't applaud or laugh at my jokes, I will reduce you in rank. And that did elicit a little bit of a laugh from the crowd. But as you mentioned, a lot of the speech was very political in nature.
Priya, Trump said, quote, "We are under invasion from an enemy within." Who is that enemy and where have they invaded?
So according to the president, he said that he has spoken to Pete, as he called him, about using our military troops to train in domestic cities because he said they are very dangerous places. And the two cities that he referred to in his speech were Chicago, where he was talking about the incompetence of Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. And he referred to a lot of murder statistics from over the weekend. And he said that the military is needed to bring those crime rates down. And then he also went on to talk about Portland, Oregon. And he said, I have spoken to Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem about using the military troops in cities where potentially ICE detention facilities are under threat from Antifa or other domestic terrorists, he called them, who are protesting outside of those facilities. So he said he's not afraid to deploy more troops across the country in these cities. And he actually thinks that those could potentially be really great training grounds for the military to train for wars overseas.
But is it clear to you who the enemy within is? Which people?
I mean, as usual, he didn't necessarily define things in specific terms. But of course, in recent weeks, we have heard a lot of rhetoric from him about labeling domestic terrorist organizations and left-wing groups. And so that seemed to be what he was alluding to. But again, you know, these are things that aren't necessarily discussed with senior military leaders. These are politics and policy decisions with people who are looking for direct orders, operational cues, how to implement these things, not necessarily all the politics behind what they have to execute on the ground. But needless to say, you know, we've seen this administration deploy troops to the border when he was talking about trying to harden the border. And then we also saw troops being deployed to Los Angeles. So we've seen this consistently over the past several months. And now they're being used in this new capacity to essentially try to squash any sort of crime and also any people that could be resisting some of his immigration policies and ICE raids across the country.
Secretary Kendall, in 2018, the invasion was used to describe a mirage of a caravan racing toward the southern border. There was no horde caravan racing toward the southern border. The invasion was something that he would go to the Roosevelt Room and warn about and talk about in the days leading up to the midterm elections. The enemy within is language he adopted during this year's presidential cycle. And he used it in interviews with Univision and Telemundo, as well as with journalists or cable hosts like Laura Ingraham, who would push back and almost try to move him off a designation of political opponents as a, quote, enemy within. He has combined two of the most dangerous rhetorical devices he's deployed since he's entered American politics. And he said to a room today of our country's top military leaders that he needs their help, or he plans to deploy them, because we are, quote, under invasion from an enemy within. He's now melded the invasion that he's long used to describe people coming to this country as asylum seekers or illegally or undocumented with language that he re-upped about a week ago, Sunday, about his opponents, saying, quote, I hate them. Where does this leave the military?
Well, first of all, Nicole, the summary earlier was fairly accurate. I listened to both Secretary Hegseth's speech and President Trump's speech in their entirety, and I really encourage people to do that. I would describe them as bizarre, unhinged, and most importantly, as you indicated earlier, dangerous. This is part of a pattern we're seeing from the administration of demonizing their political enemies. I don't think there was any confusion in particularly President Trump's speech about who those were. Radical left, Democratic mayors were specifically referred to. So we're seeing a continuation of the pattern that you talked about from earlier, and a campaign, if you will, to demonize his political opponents and to make it acceptable to use the military against them, including in our cities. That's a very dangerous time for our country.
Are those all valid questions?
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me. And yes, they are. That was a stunning display, I think, that we saw this morning from both President Trump, who used this opportunity to deliver his standard campaign style stump speech, and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who just repeated his very familiar litany of culture war issues that he has made his hallmark. I have yet to find a single military official who was in the audience today who thought that this was a good presentation. All I've had from them so far, from the people I've talked to, is a combination of disbelief that they were made to fly, some of them from Asia, from around the world, from bases in Europe and in even Africa, all the way to Quantico in Virginia, to listen to the same very familiar type of woke culture war complaints that we've been having since President Trump was reelected and since Pete Hegseth took over the running of the Defense Department. And you just saw that all over again this morning. Nothing that was said today could not have been put in an email or in a directive. So there's that to begin with. There's also the fact that so much of this was partisan, and this is a military that is supposed to present itself as nonpartisan. So you didn't hear the kind of cheering that we usually get, because President Trump is used to playing for the type of crowds that favor him. And so he's not very used to performing in front of an audience that's just looking back stone-faced. But that's what you were getting from these generals. But I've gotten so many emails from women in the military who think that this was yet another, as if they needed it again. They've heard this for months now. Another example of the fact that they believe that they are not welcome.
Do we know how much it cost to fly in all those generals and military leaders?
I haven't been able to. I would love to be able to tell you. It's hard to figure out because they were coming from all of these different places and there's so many different people involved. At the end of the day, the Pentagon claims it's not that big a cost, but you and I both know what airfare is. And in some cases, they were flying in military planes and American planes. In some cases, people came commercial. So it's I don't know what it costs, but is definitely in excess of millions.
Yeah, my parents had a helicopter. I know jet fuel is really expensive. That was back in the 90s. It's only more expensive now.
Your parents had a helicopter?
They did. They were news reporters in the helicopter. But I'll leave that aside. Tom Nichols, what I was concerned about, what I thought about when Pete Hegseth was giving that speech was not so much the woke culture war stuff, which I expect. It's the consequences of trying to go after the woke culture war and what gets wrapped up in that. The military has had a problem with sexual assault. It's been a longstanding problem and one that leaders have tried to address. When he's talking about not derailing careers, not listening to the complainers, I wonder, does that send a message to women? If you're assaulted, no one wants to hear it.
It sends a message to everybody. It says if your leader is a toxic jerk whose command is a mess and you're trying to complain to the IG or to warn your superiors that you have a leader who's somehow off the rails, and behaving inappropriately, because this is about more than just women. I mean, basically, Hegseth said, if you are a toxic leader, don't worry, I've got your back. And I think part of that is because the one person Pete Hegseth is tired of people smearing, in his mind, is Pete Hegseth, because the building keeps leaking about what a hot mess Pete Hegseth's Pentagon is. I think that the point of putting all those people in a room was to generate video clips of bold, tough alpha guy Pete Hegseth reading the Riot Act to all of these admirals and generals, many of whom, as I've pointed out many times, were officers when Pete Hegseth was still in high school. And to say, no more wokeism, no more complaining. We don't want to hear anything from, the women. We don't want to hear anything about bad leaders. We don't want, and by the way, in case people are wondering about the beard issue, the men can't have beards because of a shaving exception for a medical condition that falls heavily on black men. The targets of all of this were very clear. It was that Pete Hegseth wants it to be, the Defense Department to be a club, a kind of a frat, and everybody else isn't welcome. I mean, it was really an embarrassing, cringe-inducing speech, but it's pretty much what you'd expect from the most unqualified Secretary of Defense in American history.
And what about the other significant question I have, Mark, about the war crimes? Hegseth was a vocal advocate for a number of soldiers who were accused or convicted of war crimes. And when he's saying that there's not going to be these complaints, there's not going to be these legal tie-ups, I wonder, does it also send a message, much like in the sexual assault way? And tell me if you think I'm going too far. For soldiers who see wrongdoing out there on the battlefield, soldiers who are worried that their fellow soldiers are going too far and maybe crossing a line into committing a war crime.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a good question. I disagree with most of the answers on everything else that was said. But the issue of war crimes is one of good order and discipline. Good units don't go out in combat and make the kind of war crime inducing actions that would cause them to be arrested, which would cause them to be prosecuted. I think that was one area where I disagree with Pete Hegseth in terms of going beyond the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions have stood for decades as our left and right limits of how to operate on the battlefield. I don't think that we should be somehow changing those. All the other issues that have been discussed at this point, I take a different view from.
So tell me what your different view is.
Well, first of all, I did not hear him say anything about wanting to change equal rights, using your words. I've talked to a number of people today about that speech, and while they had many things to say about Pete Hegseth's style and demeanor, I didn't find too many that truly disagreed with his focus on combat readiness and ending some of these culture wars that have been inflicted upon the military. Last, I think that whole issue about flying officers back to Quantico and trying to argue that it's too much of an expense. We have commanders' conferences at every level. The U.S. Army has four-star conferences where they bring the four stars from all over the world to talk. Same thing with the Navy, same thing with the Air Force. Central Command brings all of its combatant commanders from the Middle East back to Tampa for these kind of meetings. So while it was unprecedented that this would be done by a Secretary of Defense, it is done by every other layer of the chain of command, and I've attended weeks and weeks of these kind of face-on-face meetings in 30 years in the military.
And talking about equal rights, I mean, that's what Pete Hegseth said in just the first soundbite I played. He said, we're doing the same with equal opportunity and military equal opportunity policies. The EO and the MEO at our department.
There's a difference between EO and equal rights. And that's what I think he was trying to come out and say. The equal opportunities sometimes have been weaponized, as has the IG at times. There's been a lot of weaponization of the complaints process. Not a week ago, I was in the Middle East, and I had some officers say they don't want to command units because every private in the unit can write a Facebook post saying that his commander did something that he didn't like, and the next thing you know, you have the IG flying down and doing an investigation. Look, I agree completely with the IGs going after clear violations of Army regulations. But the fact that in many cases you see the IG process being weaponized against senior commanders and junior commanders simply because the people don't like either the person or the standards that he or she is trying to uphold.
Let me ask you about the politics of today. Do you think it's appropriate for the president to give what is a pretty standard political speech and political rally speech that he gives lots of different places in front of the military like that, in front of those assembled generals?
Yeah, again, I've been in meetings with presidents in my Army career. Those meetings are usually straightforward and focused on the facts. I don't necessarily agree that that type of meeting should be an opportunity for partisan discussions. Let's focus on warfighting. Let's focus on the issues of readiness, the issues of operations. I agree with you in this case that President Trump probably had an opportunity to focus on those issues, operation readiness, recruiting, rather than some of the issues that he brought up.
Mark, let me get you in on this. You've been reporting on this administration, obviously on Donald Trump for a long time now. How does this fall into the vision that Donald Trump has for the military? He even mentioned today that a lot of the folks in the crowd look like they came out of central casting, which we've reported on in the past is something that Donald Trump believes works for him when he's trying to place people into positions of power.
Yeah, no, he loves the central casting thing. He was in a position today where people who he envisions that way would theoretically be applauding for him. I think it was pretty jarring to him that he was not applauded in that crowd, because I think he's used to be applauding, he's used to being applauded. And I think he probably saw this as a home field advantage for himself, which I think might have disappointed him to some degree. I do agree with a lot of what Tom said earlier, especially about the visual, the idea of having so many military commanders coming together so that this could be conceived as a kind of a pep rally that ultimately wasn't. But there is, I think, probably some value in getting everyone into the same room. I think he probably would have liked to have been more boisterous, but you obviously could not have achieved that through a Zoom or through an email or anything like that. I mean, I do wonder whose idea this whole thing was and how they think it went. I also would be very curious to know, and Helene got to this a little bit earlier, what the chit chat was sort of on the sidelines before and after the speech, what the rank and file, or what the military, what the generals were saying to each other about what they were being made to do.